The first worker at the hospital to collapse was nurse Susan Kane. She was treating a dying patient in Trauma Room 1 at Riverside General Hospital. Kane had just drawn blood through a large syringe when she noticed an ammonia-like smell. Her face then began to burn, and she eventually fainted. After this, Dr. Julie Gorczynski moved in to look at the syringe. She and another doctor, Dr. Humberto Ochoa, reported seeing pale particles inside of it. Gorczynski became nauseated and stepped away. Then she collapsed as well. She stopped breathing normally and began to shake. Respiratory therapist Maureen Welch went down next. Her stomach turned and she lost control of her limbs. And at this hospital, the people trying to save one patient were becoming patients themselves. Then came the inevitable. The emergency department began to evacuate as they realized something much, much worse was happening than they suspected. Outside, hospital workers removed their clothes and were decontaminated in the parking lot. Their clothing was sealed in bags, and inside, a small team stayed with the woman on the table and continued the resuscitation attempt. That woman's name was Gloria Ramirez. She was only 31 years old. She had 2 children, Evelyn and Angel Jr., and she had advanced cervical cancer. And by the time she reached Riverside General on February 19th in 1994, the cancer had already spread into her lymphatic tissue. She had also been nauseated and vomiting for several days leading up to the point of her admission. Gloria's boyfriend, Johnny Estrada, called for help at about 7:50 that evening. Fire and ambulance personnel found Gloria struggling to breathe with an abnormal heart rhythm. They did what they were supposed to do, and they gave her oxygen and an intravenous line. She spent roughly 14 minutes inside a confined ambulance on the way to Riverside General. Some of her blood reportedly spilled during the trip. The paramedics in the ambulance remained well. And that detail, based on what I've already said up until this point, is a problem and very interesting detail that becomes extremely relevant for every explanation offered later on in this video as to what happened with Gloria. If Gloria's body was continuously producing enough poison to empty an emergency department, then the people trapped in a small vehicle with her should have been among the first to feel it. At approximately 8:15, the ambulance arrived at Riverside General with Gloria still alive. She was semi-conscious, going in and out of consciousness, breathing rapidly and shallowly, all with a dangerously unstable rhythm in her heart. She was taken into Trauma Room 1, where the staff began a full resuscitation attempt. Maureen Welch from earlier helped ventilate her, and members of the team later described a fruity or garlic-like odor near Gloria's mouth. They also noticed what looked like a thin, oily sheen on her skin.
The night that I was with Gloria Ramirez, she was brought to the emergency room. She was in distress, difficulty breathing, and having trouble with her cardiac status.
So the team intubated Gloria, shocked her heart, and used sedatives and antiarrhythmics and emergency electrolytes to try and stabilize her. And in spite of this, Gloria continued to deteriorate. Kane began working with a second IV and drew blood using a syringe large enough to hold roughly 20 to 30 milliliters. She noticed the ammonia-like odor coming from the blood, and her face burned, and she fell. As I said. Gorczynski examined the syringe. The particles she and Ochoa described had been called white, pale, or manila colored in different accounts of the story. No one had time to collect one and put it under a microscope to see exactly what it was. Could have been a small jellyfish, for example. That's my theory.
She came to me with a radio call saying that a lady was coming in ventricular tachycardia, which is unstable, lethal heart rhythm. And she had a history of terminal cancer, and that the paramedics would be here in about 5 minutes.
A nurse had fainted, the patient was dying, and now the doctor, looking at the blood, felt sick too. So Gorczynski leaves the immediate area and slumps to the floor. Her breathing fails, her body begins to tremble, with Welch becoming the next member of the team to collapse. Ochoa gave the order and helped clear the room. The hospital stopped accepting new emergency patients and redirected them elsewhere, and a small, extremely brave group of professionals remained behind to continue working on Gloria. She was pronounced dead at 8:50 p.m., about an hour after the original ambulance call. Her body was placed inside 2 bags, sealed in an airtight container, and kept apart from the rest of the hospital. Sally Balderas, a technician who returned to help move the body, later developed retching and a burning sensation on her skin. Outside, the people who normally ran the emergency room stood under decontamination lights in the parking lot. Some were even loaded into ambulances and taken to other hospitals to be treated for their symptoms. So now, with all this context, Riverside General's emergency staff had treated a patient that came in with some kind of unknown disorder. Then started fearing contamination consequences. They eventually evacuated their own department, then began sending one another to competing emergency rooms without fully knowing what they had encountered. You may have heard of this story before. This is the story of Gloria Ramirez.
There was pandemonium at Riverside General Hospital last Saturday night after a medical team was overcome by fumes which rose from the blood of a dying patient.
Now, of course, a hazardous materials team eventually arrived at around 11 p.m. The hazard group's members entered in protective equipment and tested for gases, including the classics: hydrogen sulfide, hydrogen cyanide, and phosgene. All of them are detectable, and even detectable with your nose. Phosgene, for example, smells like freshly cut hay, which I love that smell. If I smelled that, I wouldn't be alarmed at all. The team's instruments detected none of these gases officially, but the readings came hours after the room had been emptied and ventilated, so they could not directly reconstruct the air that was in that room the moment that Kane used that syringe to draw blood from Gloria. The hazardous materials team released the emergency department at around 3:05 the next morning. The room was sanitized and reopened around 7, and Gloria's body was transferred to the coroner later that morning. Riverside General's emergency room reopened long before the people that were taken out of it for their symptoms fully recovered, which is pretty mind-boggling because the hazard team didn't find anything. There's, of course, a lot more investigation that we'll get into. The first thought, if you can't find anything, is maybe this is psychosomatic, maybe it's hysteria. But Gorczynski required roughly 2 weeks of hospital and intensive care, and her early course included episodes in which she could not breathe on her own adequately, along with tremors and convulsions. Other accounts later described hepatitis, pancreatitis, and vascular necrosis, which is damage caused when a bone loses its blood supply. Valderas remained hospitalized for 10 days. Not quite as long as Gorczynski, but still a very long time for a hysterical reaction. Obviously it's not that. And the severity of both of these cases are the central objections to the explanation that, maybe this was just fear, maybe this was just hysteria. This isn't seeming like it was hysteria. All right. Gloria's body presented a different problem. The coroner's team could not begin by assuming that she was simply harmless because of the evidence of other people being contaminated. The professionals used extensive protective equipment during the first examination, which lasted about 90 minutes.
At that time, when you breathe in, the suits kind of blow up with the air, and we're in kind of an enclosed situation when we were doing the autopsy. Plus, we did not remove Gloria from the protective type unit that she was in, and we were concerned about the sharp points on this metal type container that she was in. So we didn't want to actually cut our clothing or their protective suits and so forth.
Tissue, blood, and bile were collected for toxicology while the body continued to be treated as a possible source of exposure. Now, of course, that caution was rational. It also hardened the image that was already forming around Gloria, the uncertainty, the mystery. By the time this story had hit the news, Gloria had become known as the Toxic Lady, an unfortunate name that her family absolutely hated, as you can probably imagine. The first investigation began with the room in which all of this went down. Riverside General had experienced environmental problems before. Contemporary reporting described a sewer gas incident in 1993, algae in the water reservoir in 1992, and a possible sterilizer gas problem in 91. Therefore, hospital workers had reasons to wonder whether the building itself had potentially made them all sick. Public works personnel, hospital engineers, state health investigators, and even California occupational safety officials all looked for a source, but no inspection connected one to the events in Trauma Room 1. And with what I mentioned a little while ago, we know that their searches started with several disadvantages. The emergency department had already been cleaned and ventilated. Some workplace interviews occurred weeks after the event, and the agencies investigating didn't have access to all the same medical and coroner information. The air in the room was gone, and the room itself had been cleaned and changed, and the object at the center of the first collapse, the syringe with manila-colored floating particulates, was following the ordinary path through the hospital's waste system. It was in the trash. But still, in early March, a hospital spokesman said that the syringe had been accounted for and analyzed properly. The hospital later acknowledged that that statement was incorrect. The blood had been transferred into specimen tubes and preserved, but the syringe itself had probably been dropped into a sharpest container and incinerated because it's trash. All because the hazardous materials team had not been told to recover that specific instrument. It's normal practice for hospitals to throw used needles and syringes into sharpest containers containers because, as you can imagine, guys, leaving them around is dangerous. And in general, being burnt to a crisp is where most blood-filled syringes they belong there. But in this situation with this containment and this toxic event on that night, the normal procedure destroyed the one object that may have preserved the manila particles, the residue, or potentially even the vapor space that was involved in the first collapse. Because it isn't just the liquid that's in the syringe, it's the vapor or what's on the syringe, the oily residue, the garlic scent, the ammonia scent. Who the knows? Now, the coroner was able to investigate a much narrower and hopefully simpler to answer question. What killed Gloria? The official cause of death was cardiac dysrhythmia caused by acute renal failure, which was caused by cervical cancer. The cancer had spread to lymphatic tissue and may have obstructed the organs needed to drain urine from her kidneys. Her kidneys were failing, and salts and waste products in her body were accumulating, and her heart could no longer maintain a stable rhythm. Toxicology detected lidocaine, acetaminophen, codeine, and morphine. Acetone was also elevated in her body. Investigators searched for solvents, pesticides, organophosphate compounds, ammonia, phosgene, hydrogen cyanide, hydrogen sulfide, and other familiar poisons to explain possibly what happened outside of Gloria's body, but none explained what had happened to the staff. The coroner also had to distinguish drugs used during the resuscitation from anything that Gloria had encountered beforehand. Lidocaine in her samples, for example, was expected after the treatment for a dangerous heart rhythm. And with everything that was going on with Gloria and the interventions that the doctors and professionals were trying to use to save her life, plenty of chemicals are used in that process. So finding a substance is just the beginning. Investigators must determine whether it was prescribed, administered during the emergency, formed as a breakdown product, or produced naturally, or introduced by some kind of exposure. Gloria's family questioned the official account, and they hired and arranged a private autopsy for their own minds, as is their right completely. The family's examination took place only after weeks of argument over access and safety. Reporting at the time described the sealed body container being opened more than once and under different protective conditions without the family immediately understanding everything that had been done. Because officials were trying to manage a possible hazard, Gloria's relatives saw the person that they loved being handled like hazardous material while receiving little useful explanations to what the happened to her. And the official cause of death explained what happened to Gloria, logically, but Kane falling over the syringe and Gorczynski losing the ability to breathe and Welch collapsing beside the treatment table, that was outside of the official explanation. So answering one question made the others even more glaring and impossible to really even ponder. I just used the word ponder. You can punch me in the face if you want. The lab work reached basically the same dead end. Riverside had sent preserved samples of Gloria's heart, blood, bile, liver, brain, lungs, and kidneys to scientists at Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory to do a very deep lab investigation. The first request to Livermore was sent out in late March. Samples were transported on dry ice, and laboratory used instruments capable of separating complex mixtures and identifying compounds by the fragments that they produce. Real science type shit. By mid-April, the initial answer was effectively negative. There was no poison that had been found that could explain the emergency department event. And it was the end of that month in which the coroner closed the cause of death for Gloria. But then Maureen Welch contacted the laboratory again. Welch had survived the collapse and assembled a file on the case, as a professional might, and she emphasized details that potentially the conventional toxicology had left disconnected. The oily sheen, the garlic-like breath, the ammonia smell, and the manila particles in the syringe. And plus, the range of symptoms from the exposed staff. And after this, when Livermore scientists reconsidered their data, one previously confusing chemical signal got itself a new name. It's called dimethyl sulfone. The finding became the foundation for the most complete explanation that anyone has produced for the night that Gloria Ramirez died. The theory starts with a different chemical whose name is almost identical. That is dimethyl sulfoxide, usually shortened to DMSO. DMSO is this. It is an industrial solvent and it passes through skin unusually well and had developed a bit of a following around that time as an alternative treatment for pain. People would apply this topically for arthritis, skin injuries, painful shit in their bodies, and for symptoms that approved medicine had failed to relieve. Cancer patients could even find claims that it might reduce pain or even help other treatments penetrate tissue. And topical DMSO could account for 2 of the observations in Trauma Room 1. It is an oily liquid, and after it enters the body, people can develop a garlic-like taste or odor on their breath. So in the Livermore scenario, Gloria may have applied DMSO to her body before the ambulance arrived. The oily sheen on her skin was the DMSO itself, and the fruity or garlic smell near her mouth was the trace after it metabolized through her body. So maybe that makes sense. And then the ambulance crew, when she's picked up, placed an oxygen mask over her face, and at the hospital, the team supplied more oxygen during ventilation and resuscitation, and under normal conditions, DMSO can oxidize into dimethyl sulfone, which was the substance that Livermore found in Gloria's blood and bile. And the scientists proposed that the oxygen combined with the extreme chemistry inside of a dying patient drove that conversion faster than usual. Plus, her renal failure made the idea more likely. Healthy kidneys help remove compounds from the blood, but Gloria's kidneys were no longer doing that work as they should have under normal circumstances, and if her body had received a large dose of DMSO and converted it into dimethyl sulfone, the product could build up and accumulate in her blood or bile. So now the theory had a proposed starting material that could possibly match the oily skin and garlic odor. And there was a reason that it might change inside Gloria into another compound. But what about the manila particles in the syringe? Dimethyl sulfone also possibly answers that. Livermore scientists place it in Ringer solution, which is a salt solution that's used in medical care, and warmed the liquid to roughly body temperature, and the dimethyl sulfone stayed dissolved. When they allowed the solution to cool, white crystals appeared. And the blood inside Gloria's body was warm, obviously. Blood pulled into a syringe would begin to cool to room temperature, and if her blood carried enough dimethyl sulfone, the material could precipitate as particles while Gorczynski and Ochoa were looking at it, hence the white, manila-colored chunks in the blood. So this is kind of making a little bit of sense here, but it still does not make sense of why people were dropping like flies. For that, the scientists at Livermore proposed one more chemical transformation. Dimethyl sulfone would have to undergo another oxidation and become dimethyl sulfate. Dimethyl sulfate is an industrial chemical that's used to transfer methyl groups during manufacturing. What does that mean? I have no idea, but it is corrosive and toxic at very low concentrations and classified as a potential occupational carcinogen. It can injure the eyes, skin, and airways, and severe exposure can affect the liver, kidneys, and nervous system. So Livermore proposed that reactive oxygen enzymes in the abnormal conditions inside Gloria's body or potentially her blood allowed dimethyl sulfone to become dimethyl sulfate, which is possible. I mean, crazy stuff can happen chemically under crazy circumstances, and possibly the large syringe provided a release point for this change. Kane drew a concentrated sample, and a small quantity of the new chemical escaped from the blood and struck the people leaning closest to it. And this wouldn't be like a big green cloud from SpongeBob filling the hospital for hours. It would be a small puff in one room that was concentrated at face level or, inspection level of this crazy syringe. So by the time a hazardous materials team would arrive a few hours later, the material would have reacted with water, tissue, the air, and it would have moved into ventilation systems or whatever, and the negative air tests would be expected. So if we think about it, the pattern in the first severe cases seems to fit. Kane was handling the syringe, Gorczynski leaned over it, Welch was beside the patient, and before that, the paramedics who brought Gloria to the emergency room were unaffected because the final reaction had not yet occurred in the ambulance. It was a combination of all the other events in the trauma room that led to this possible plume. That's a theory. We still don't know. A big question is, does dimethyl sulfate lead to the symptoms that the workers claimed to experience? Nausea, weakness, dizziness, respiratory difficulty, tremors, kidney injury, burning skin, liver injury. No single worker displayed the entire list of possible outcomes for dimethyl sulfate. The scientists found numerous overlap across the group. terms of symptoms that they might expect. Plus, Gloria's blood contained approximately 590 micrograms of sulfate per gram, and depending on which reference range the scientists use, that is roughly 20 to 80 times the expected level of sulfate in blood. So, case closed. The theory explains everything. The oily sheen was DMSO applied for pain. The garlic odor was the metabolism of the DMSO. Oxygen converted it into dimethyl sulfone. Kidney failure allowed that material to accumulate. Livermore eventually detected it. Cooling blood produced the crystals, and a final oxidation created dimethyl sulfate in a puff from a syringe that struck the closest workers, with the room's airflow carrying it away to spare everyone else. But not too fast, though, because the coroner released the outline of the theory to the public before Livermore had completed a fully peer-reviewed paper, with one of the laboratory scientists later complaining that the early idea had been overstated. But by then, the story had an ending. A sick and dying woman in a lot of pain had accidentally turned a pain remedy into poison inside her own body. It wasn't for 3 years that the complete scientific paper would appear in 1997. And if you read it closely, it does not say that the case was solved. They still don't know what the happened to Gloria. The laboratory did not detect DMSO in Gloria's body. It did detect dimethyl sulfone, the second chemical in the chain, and DMSO can become dimethyl sulfone, so that finding is definitely consistent with the theory. But also, dimethyl sulfone can occur in the human body through the metabolism of sulfur-containing amino acids, which is a shitload of amino acids. So its presence doesn't just mean DMSO was the source. And Gloria's family denied that she ever used DMSO. And investigators never produced a bottle from her home, a receipt, a medical note, or a witness who had ever seen her apply it. So, not a lot of evidence. And even less evidence, the final chemical in the chain, the crazy evil one, was also missing and never officially reported. No one ever detected dimethyl sulfate in Gloria's preserved samples, and no one ever detected it on a worker or on a surface or in the room or in the syringe, and the syringe also no longer existed, by the way. It was incinerated. And additionally, at room temperature, dimethyl sulfate is a colorless, oily liquid with a relatively low vapor pressure, not exactly a gas that just wants to explode out of your blood like nitrogen and people in space. It can still produce a dangerous vapor, but all things considered, it's very unlikely. Then there's also the unexplained ammonia smell. How awkward. None of the proposed sulfur compounds naturally supplied a clean match for that. And 2 years before the final paper appeared in 1997, the British documentary series Equinox had already asked a laboratory to try a simplified version of the idea. So researchers at Imperial College in London combined about 30 milliliters of blood with 10 milliliters of DMSO. Then they supplied oxygen for approximately 30 minutes, then analyzed the mixture using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry. The instrument and tests found the DMSO that the researchers had added, but it found no dimethyl sulfone and no dimethyl sulfate. So that sucks, but of course the experiment omitted a bunch of other stuff like the terminal cancer, renal failure, emergency drugs, and so on and so forth. So they don't have any idea. It's still unexplained, okay? That's the point. This is a mystery. And what's worse is that dimethyl sulfate can cause serious eye and airway injury, but in documented exposures, the worst effects are delayed for several hours, and Riverside's first workers became faint or neurologically distressed within minutes. And oh, my eyes burn didn't exactly dominate the earliest accounts of what was going on in that room, but they did complain about it later. There were a bunch of other science and clinical tests in regard to this explanation, but officially it is only a possible chemical explanation, and it is still completely unsolved. In spite of all the clinical and scientific testing, the best case is the DMSO was a possible chemical explanation. It's the strongest single chemical theory in the entire case, but it's still a possible explanation with too many loose ends and not enough evidence to confidently say this is exactly what happened, which is horrifying. Nobody knows what caused 5 workers in total to collapse, 3 of which were hospitalized for a while, and 37 workers in total reported symptoms. 23 of the 37 considered in the investigation reported at least one symptom. 11 reported noticing an odor, and 6 people in total were sent to hospitals. 5 were actually admitted, and then 3 stayed for a while. The state interviewed 34 of the 37 workers and compared where they had been and what they had handled and what they had smelled, what what they saw and when their symptoms started and how severely they became ill. With that information, they created a reconstruction, and that was not obviously a real-time experiment, but people were describing a fast, frightening event after discussing it with colleagues and receiving medical treatment, also watching news coverage, and then learning which details investigators considered important. And many of these interviews occurred weeks after the event itself. Once again, the most severely affected people were the ones closest to Gloria, within a feet or two, and specifically around that syringe. So that supports an exposure near the patient or the syringe. There are other associations, though, for example, that are harder to connect to something like that. Although men were present in the larger group that experienced symptoms, all 5 workers that were admitted to the hospital were women. Plus, workers who had skipped their evening meal also appeared more likely to have become ill at the time. And as you probably can imagine, sex in an empty stomach can affect susceptibility to some different exposures in the way we metabolize things, toxins, and shit like that. Through all the data that was found, there was an association that this affected women more strongly, but maybe they were just the ones closer to Gloria and so on and so forth. Where was everybody working at it? There was a lot of data, but the data was not perfect. And even with the association, there was no female-specific mechanism causing all of this. So what was the conclusion of the state? The outbreak was most compatible with a sociogenic illness. Hysteria, mass hysteria. What? How is that possible? Well, officially, it's because real symptoms spread through a group without there being an identified organic agent that could explain those symptoms spreading through that group. So basically, they made it all up. What? That's what the state thinks? That's absolutely insane. But if you think about it, kind of makes sense a little bit. An emergency room is a scary place, and it creates the necessary conditions required for a mass hysteria event like this. People are watching the same patient. The patient has all kinds of crazy stuff going on with them. They understand that invisible hazards and outbreaks and horrors exist, and these people are all trained to react quickly to blood, gas, infection, contamination, and outbreaks. So possibly one of them says something smells wrong and then passes out, and then everybody else just starts doing it too. And it's kind of difficult to understand that this isn't just playing pretend. The nervous system can produce severe physical effects without, letting you know or asking permission first. Psychosomatic illnesses or sociogenic mass hysteria outbreaks. Ever heard of the dancing plague? Plus, there were several patterns that gave the state more and more reasons to consider this as the official explanation. Symptoms spread very rapidly, and they varied across the group. Nobody experienced the exact same thing. No environmental agent was ever measured. The ambulance workers remained completely unaffected, and people had watched colleagues collapse and then undergone their own emergency evacuation and decontamination procedure, all while being told that the source might be a dying patient's blood. That sounds like the beginning of a horror movie, really, so it makes a little bit of sense. Then you had the hazard response crew and the hazmats. That's even scarier, and obviously all those measures were completely necessary because the hospital had no idea what exactly it faced, and everybody was just doing their best. And if you're watching all of this unfold after you've been exposed, seeing the people in the hazmat suits becomes new evidence inside of your mind and body while you're observing all of this, not sure what the is happening or going down around you. But even this conclusion has a massive hole in it. Kane was handling the blood when she fell, and Gorczynski looked into the same syringe and developed severe respiratory trouble. Welch was close to Gloria, and even in the state's own association's proximity and IV work were there. And the reports from the time describe an intensive care stay, hepatitis, pancreatitis, and the later avascular necrosis. These first 3 people got f***ed up by whatever happened to them. They didn't just make it up, unless your body can just be tricked into not sending blood to your bone marrow anymore. Now, what happens if you take the DMSO explanation and you combine it with the sociogenic explanation, aka the one where they just all made it all up, kinda? You make them all combine, and then you have the real event that then propagated beyond the real event into something that was still absolutely real, but also kind of made up. By the way, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, okay? I understand how insane the human mind is, and I'm not being like, well, if I was there, I would have been freaking out. I'm freaking out now, and it's been 30 years, okay? Phew. The most elaborate hospital allegation arrived in 1997, the same year the Livermore paper dropped. A Los Angeles alternative newspaper, kind of like a YouTube channel at the time, proposed that clandestine methamphetamine production had contaminated intravenous materials with chemicals such as methylamine. Ever heard of methylamine? Methylamine can smell like ammonia or fish and burn the eyes, skin, and airways. I love Breaking Bad. It's one of my favorite shows of all time. The resemblance there just stops at the odor and general irritation. No clandestine laboratory was ever verified at Riverside General. Just in case you were wondering, there was no contaminated IV bag, no precursor container of methylamine, no law enforcement findings, or patient sample or establishment of any kind of methylamine or meth production of any kind, but this is a real thing. It's crazy. The coroner said a natural disease killed Gloria, which makes perfect sense. The state said a sociogenic process best explained what happened to the group, and Livermore said a chemical scenario was possible. Plus, Cal OSHA said that an agent may have affected the first workers. So all these things can all be kind of true at once, except for the meth thing. That's insane. But in February of 1994, the public story was absolutely immediate and insane. A woman entered an emergency room and caregivers began collapsing around her. The sealed body bag and parking lot decontamination and the pictures of that made the patient herself appear to be the source of all of this, and she eventually was referred to as the toxic woman. Then in March, the family objected to the unfortunate portrayal of Gloria, and the hospital assured reporters that the syringe that had this toxic substance possibly had been accounted for, but it didn't. In April, the public learned that the syringe was gone and that Gloria was finally buried, and the coroner closed her death as a consequence of cancer and renal failure without explaining what exactly happened to the caregivers and the workers. By September of 1994, we had the sociogenic explanation from the state. Then in 1995, the Livermore scenario was the molecule by molecule solution to the case. The Equinox experiment came, and then in 1997, the official paper made the whole thing even more sophisticated and more confusing, and we still don't know what happened. There was quite a bit of legal aftermath as well. Julie Gorczynski filed a claim seeking $6 million. She alleged that unsafe conditions and failures in the hospital's response contributed to her and others' injuries, specifically hers in terms of the payout, but her attorneys questioned why the ventilation had not been shut down immediately and why hazardous materials personnel arrived when they did, and why the room was cleaned and why the syringe was destroyed. Gloria's family pursued Riverside County for different reasons. Their case included allegations about the emergency care that she received and a claim that the county had failed to inform her about an abnormal pap smear in 1991 that, consequently led to some of these things happening. And the family alleged that learning of the result earlier could have changed her medical course, which is absolutely, completely tragic. In 1998, Riverside County agreed to a settlement with Gloria's family for $350,000, of course, without admitting wrongdoing. And that agreement neither established that Gloria admitted a poison nor that the hospital caused the worker outbreak. So it was just the family's central complaint there. And with that extremely tragic case comes nothing, because it's still unsolved. Let me know what you think happened down below. Do you think it was a mix of all the possible explanations? It's kind of what I believe. Not that it really matters. This is just a absolute horror story, something that happened to humans in the 1990s, and I like talking about that kind of stuff. So if you guys want to see anything else like this, comment down below some suggestions, and I'll see you in the next video.